The Nicomachean Ethics is named after Aristotle's son, Nicomachus, who is believed to have edited various notes into a single revised text on Aristotle's Ethics. You can thus think of the Nicomachean Ethics as very old lecture notes on Aristotle's ethical views. There are three main parts of this lecture. In the first part, we examine the goal of Book 1, which is to identify the highest good for humans. In the second part, we examine the types and nature of virtue, which is the focus of Book 2. The final part consists of Aristotle's most complete sketch of the ideally happy human life. Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics begins with a discussion of the good. Aristotle has a teleological view of nature. Teleology is a fancy-sounding word, but the idea is simple. The root of the word is telos, which means end or goal in ancient Greek. Aristotle thinks that every intentional human activity has a purpose, and that purpose, in the most general sense, is to achieve some good. Among the many different goods that we pursue, some goods are more important than others. One clear example of this is when we only perform an activity in order to gain a product from it. For example, I would only take medicine in order to regain my health. Taking the medicine is a good thing, but the more important good is health. Hence, some activities are only instrumentally valuable. Some activities are a means to an end. Medicine, for example, is a means for achieving health. In cases like this, the end is always more important than the means. Aristotle believes that there must be at least one end that is intrinsically valuable. In other words, there must be one end that is enjoyed for itself rather than as a means to something else. Aristotle's argument only makes sense if you understand his background commitment to a teleological view of nature. Everything that exists, not just human activities, are thought to have a purpose or function. Given this general view of nature, it would be absurd for something to exist that does not have a purpose. Aristotle thinks that if humans only had instrumental desires, then they would lack an ultimate purpose. Notice that this teleological view of nature conflicts with our modern understanding of nature. Modern science recognizes the presence of many things in nature that lack a purpose. Consider the human appendix, for example. It is an evolutionary vestige that no longer serves any role in human digestion. Nicomachean Ethics, in this way, serves as another example of how a metaphysical position can influence a person's ethics. The next step in Aristotle's argument is to identify the hierarchy of goods in human life. The ancient Greeks used the same word to refer to crafts and sciences. Both are based on knowledge. Having established that some goods are more important than others, Aristotle then argues that there are a hierarchy of crafts. That is to say, some crafts only exist in order to serve higher crafts. Consider bridle making and horsemanship. Bridles are the things that go around a horse's head and then enable a rider to steer the horse. Bridle making is obviously subservient to horsemanship, which covers all the various skills that make for a good horse rider. As with human desires, Aristotle believes there must be one ultimate craft. This craft, according to Aristotle, is politics, since politics determines which crafts are pursued in a community. The most basic task of a political leader is to determine how many people should study medicine, how many become generals, and so on. The graphic on the left only covers a very few crafts. This graphic is not meant to be a chart of all the crafts practiced in Athens, but rather to give you a sense of how some crafts are subservient to others. Next, Aristotle identifies humans' highest good, happiness. There are various other things that humans value greatly, including virtue, friendship, health, and wealth, but doesn't everyone agree that they want to be happy? And doesn't everyone agree that happiness should be enjoyed for its own sake, rather than as a means to something else? As we work through the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics, we will unpack how virtue, friendship, and the rest relate to happiness. The key for the present moment is simply that happiness is the highest human good. The Greek word that is translated as happiness is eudaimonia. It's a less than perfect translation, since eudaimonia is not a transitory emotion that we can feel at one moment but not the next. Eudaimonia is also translated as flourishing in order to convey the idea that it's a way of life. I'll use happiness and flourishing interchangeably when discussing Aristotle's notion of the highest good. Feel free to use either term. Even though there is near universal agreement that happiness is intrinsically valuable, there is widespread disagreement about what happiness actually is. Aristotle identifies what he considers the three most basic views of happiness. For someone who lives a life of physical gratification, they believe happiness consists in vulgar pleasures, such as eating, drinking, and having sex. By contrast, someone who lives a political life believes that happiness consists in being honored. In other words, this person dedicates themselves to politics because they want to be remembered by their community. Think of major political figures like George Washington or social justice fighters like Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez. Finally, the life of study is based upon the belief that happiness consists of developing our rational abilities to the fullest extent possible. In order to determine which view of happiness is the correct one, Aristotle seeks to identify the function of humans. Aristotle begins with easier questions. The crafts have easily identifiable purposes since they were invented by people to serve particular ends. Particular body parts seem to be fairly obvious as well. The purpose of an eye is to see, a hand is for grabbing, a heart is for pumping blood. But what about the function of the human individual as a whole, not just one of the human body's organs? To answer this question, Aristotle uses a process of elimination argument. The reason why the argument feels condensed is that it's assumed that you read Aristotle's previous works. Aristotle presents three possible human functions. Life is the first candidate, but is dismissed because life is shared with all other organisms, including plants. Sense perception is the second candidate, but this is shared with other animals, such as horses and oxen. This leaves only one other option, namely reason. Aristotle believes that humans are the only animals with rational capacities, and thus it is our function. Notice the implications for the previous discussion of happiness. The life of study cultivates our rational capacities to the fullest extent possible. As a result, the life of study is the ideal way to pursue happiness. In the final portion of Book 1, Aristotle discusses other important requirements for attaining happiness. There are a number of external requirements. The most important external requirements are having virtuous friends, wealth, and political power. These are not intrinsically valuable. Instead, Aristotle views them as instrumental resources, that is, tools for accomplishing great deeds. A good example of wealth being used as a resource for accomplishing morally excellent things is Bill Gates. Bill Gates has used a significant portion of his wealth to combat the biggest global health crises, like malaria. Notice that individuals only have limited control over whether they can achieve a happy life. This is clearest in connection with requirements of good birth, good children, and beauty. Aristotle believes that you need to be lucky in order to be happy. Luck plays such an important part that no one is guaranteed a happy life while they are still alive. No matter how virtuous, wealthy, powerful, and lucky someone has been, it's possible for him or her to suffer a devastating misfortune. To support this point, Aristotle references Solon, a famous Greek legislator. Solon said that no one can be counted happy while still alive, precisely because a devastating misfortune could still occur to the person. By the end of Book 1, we see two major differences between Aristotle and Plato. First, as just discussed, Aristotle thinks that luck plays a role in ethics. Not so for Plato, who only thought a person had to maintain his or her moral integrity. Second, Aristotle doesn't think that philosophy and politics are hostile to each other. Participating in politics is important, Aristotle argues, for achieving great deeds. Participating in politics, however, does not guarantee that you will accomplish something noble. Let's now turn to Book 2, where we examine the element of happiness that we do have a significant amount of control over, namely becoming virtuous. Although luck is a necessary condition for achieving happiness, it is not enough by itself. The topic of Book 2 is virtue, the element of happiness that we have the most control over. In Book 2, Aristotle identifies two basic types of virtue, examines the nature of virtue, and then looks at specific virtues. One of the key themes of Aristotle's ethics is a distinction between practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge. Unlike Plato, Aristotle believes that ethics is based on practical knowledge as distinct from theoretical knowledge. You can think of practical knowledge as any embodied skill that can only be learned from practice. Sports like golf are great examples. There is some theoretical knowledge that is required, such as advice on how to hold a golf club and how to determine when to use which clubs. These are examples of theoretical knowledge since you can learn these sorts of things by reading books and watching videos on golf. But even if you spent thousands of hours reading about, writing about, and watching golf, you still would not be a good golf player unless you physically practiced the game. This is the sense in which golf involves practical knowledge. Another way of thinking about practical knowledge is as an embodied skill that you cannot fully put into words. These kinds of skill must be learned through thousands of hours of practice. Intellectual virtue corresponds to theoretical knowledge. Moral virtue corresponds to practical knowledge. But what does the theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge distinction look like in ethics? One way to understand the distinction is in the example of Pope Francis, the current head of the Catholic Church. Pope Francis has criticized people who focus on hot-button political issues, arguing that people should be focused instead on helping people who are suffering. Pope Francis, pictured at the bottom, is famous for washing the feet of his poorest congregants. If washing the feet of poor people impacts you in a way that simply reading about a poor person's situation cannot do, then such charitable acts would be an example of practical knowledge. In other words, you would learn something concerning morals that you could only learn by actually performing the action, and the more you perform the action, the more you learn. For Aristotle, habits are a much better indication of how someone will behave in comparison to someone's beliefs. Think of any bad habit that you have. Calling it a bad habit implies that you recognize that you would be better off acting differently. And yet, it can still be extremely difficult to break bad habits. Aristotle's emphasis on practical knowledge highlights the importance of action as distinct from your beliefs about what is right and wrong. Yet when it comes to judging someone's character, it is not enough to merely look at their actions. It is not just what you do, but also how you do it. More specifically, Aristotle is concerned with how pleasures and pains motivate you. Let's say you acted virtuously and even did so intentionally rather than by accident. You did a good thing, but you would fail to be virtuous if doing the right thing caused you pain. Here's an example. Imagine that a family of yours, say a brother or sister, is completely broke and unable to pay their bills. You provide financial assistance, but privately you think your brother or sister doesn't have any money because they are lazy. So even though you care for the brother or sister, giving the money is painful. In such a situation, Aristotle thinks you fail to possess the virtue of generosity, even though you might be close to achieving it in your moral development. Conversely, you might fail to act virtuously, but feel sincerely bad about it. Building on the generosity example, you might be short of cash yourself and thus decline to provide any financial assistance. If you lament your action and chastise yourself for not finding a creative way to provide help, then Aristotle might even consider you closer to the virtue of generosity than in the first scenario. There are other ways in which someone can act virtuously without possessing the virtue. Aristotle gives two examples. You might act virtuously by chance, or you might have simply followed someone else's instructions. It's worth emphasizing that in these cases, it doesn't mean that you are a bad person, but instead that you require further moral development to become a virtuous person. In the middle of Book 2, Aristotle tackles the problem of explaining what virtue is. He wants to explain its metaphysical nature. Notice that this is a theoretical question. Even though ethics is a practical inquiry, a study aimed at changing the way we act, there are still important theoretical questions that must be answered. In this case, Aristotle thinks that determining the nature of virtue will help us understand how to acquire them. The key metaphysical claim is that virtues are intermediate states that are relative to individuals. This means that every virtue is bounded by two vices, a vice of deficiency and a vice of excess. To claim that the intermediate state is relative to individuals is simply to say that an individual must take their specific circumstances into account in order to determine exactly how the individual needs to act in order to achieve the virtue. Think of this point in terms of the generosity example. Donating $20 to the Red Cross to help with a refugee crisis would not be charitable for a billionaire like Bill Gates, but it certainly would be for a cash-strapped college student. There are virtues that don't seem to be bounded by two vices. Courage and temperance are two examples. You might think that people who fail to be courageous are always cowards, and people who lack temperance are always indulgent, gluttonous pigs. In these two cases, the opposite vice is much less common. Most people who lack courage are cowards, but there is also a vice of excess. People who are so rash that they lack fear. With regard to temperance, there are some people who are prudish and try to avoid pleasures, even if these people are much less common than the majority of people who think happiness consists in satisfying vulgar physical pleasures. One of the reasons that moral development is difficult is that there is not a single universal path for acquiring the virtues. Someone, for instance, who is extremely rash is better off aiming for cowardice rather than courage in order to compensate for his or her rashness. Given the severity of their vice, if the rash person aimed instead at being courageous, he or she could more easily backslide into being rash. For most people, however, aiming to be a coward would be a terrible idea. The more general lesson is that each individual needs to think about him or herself in order to know how best to transform themselves. Each needs to know what bad habits they need to overcome. The inherent contingencies of life are another reason why moral development is difficult. New circumstances or a shortage of time might force an individual to prioritize between competing moral claims. For Aristotle, it's even possible that circumstances might be so bleak as to undermine any chance you have at being a virtuous person. This is a general reason why good fortune and friends are essential to becoming and staying a virtuous person. Let's now turn to Book 10, the final part of the Nicomachean Ethics. The final part of the Nicomachean Ethics fills in more details about the happy life. Aristotle gives as much detail as is possible, but recognizes that this is only an outline or sketch that has to be filled out by individuals. Turning now to Book 10, we see more details about how true human happiness relates to virtue. The argument in Book 1 regarding humans' function established that contemplative activity is the best or most fulfilling form of happiness. Aristotle attempts to expand on this general point by noting additional advantages to living a life of study. Contemplative reasoning is the most continuous type of pleasure because we tire less quickly than other forms of physical activity, like, say, running. Contemplative reasoning is also the most self-sufficient activity because we can perform it on our own. Finally, Aristotle thinks that studying the mysteries of the universe is loved for its own sake, separate from any practical advantages made possible by the studies. In other words, Aristotle thinks the life of the mind is driven by curiosity, not the practical benefits that result from study. This point is important for Aristotle, given his claim in Book 1 that the highest good must be desired for its own sake, not as a means to some other end. The point about needing a complete term of life relates back to the earlier discussion about needing luck. If an individual lives a contemplative life but suffers a great tragedy, then Aristotle doesn't think this person has lived a truly happy human life. Toward the middle of Book 10, Aristotle poses the following question: is the will or the deed more essential to virtue? This came up earlier in Book 2. There are times when we do the right thing for the wrong reasons, and conversely we might have the right intentions, but our actions had a negative effect. Aristotle argues that both are equally important. The outcome of our actions, the deed, is equally important as our intentions. And the more noble an action is, the more external requirements are involved. Compare this to two other influential moral philosophers. Immanuel Kant argues that the will alone is what is ethically important. The effect of our actions is practically important, but Kant thinks this is distinct from moral importance. Meanwhile, John Stuart Mill thinks that the most morally important consideration is the consequences that our actions have. Thus, you can think of Aristotle's position as acknowledging aspects of both Kant's and Mill's moral theories. Our portion of the Nicomachean Ethics concludes with a sketch of what a truly happy life looks like according to Aristotle. This person is moderately wealthy. This means their basic physical needs are taken care of, which allows the person to pursue a life of study. The person acts nobly, which is to say they are virtuous and have helped their friends, family, and larger community. And the third general feature that Solon notes is that the person lived a pleasant life, but not an overindulgent one. It's not necessary to be rich in order to do what is morally right, but having access to resources can enable us to do greater things, to do more for our friends and larger community. Aristotle's ethics makes becoming virtuous the most general goal. It is for this reason that present-day philosophers refer to Aristotle's ethics as virtue ethics. If we are lucky and have the help of friends, we will become virtuous, accomplish great deeds, and ultimately have lived a happy life. Remember that happiness for Aristotle is a way of life, not an emotional state. His ethics is meant to be a guide for an entire life, not just for transitory moments. Virtue ethics has seen a resurgence in moral philosophy within the last 50 years. The key principle of all virtue ethics theories, including Aristotle's, is that moral character is the primary concern of ethics. One main reason that virtue ethics has seen a renewed interest is because many ethicists have come to doubt whether it is possible to give a set of rules that could serve as a general standard for all ethical dilemmas. In this context, focusing on an agent's character is meant to provide a more concrete way of becoming a good person and also of judging moral right and wrong.